Every year, men walk into outlaw motorcycle clubs believing they understand what prospecting means. Most of them are wrong. What the club tells you before you join and what it actually costs you are two entirely different things. Here is what they leave out. What prospecting actually is and what the mythology gets wrong. There is a version of the prospecting story that circulates in biker bars, in online forums, in YouTube channels built around motorcycle club culture, and in the kind of campfire storytelling that men who have been around outlaw clubs like to do for the benefit of men who haven't. In this version, prospecting is a rite of passage, a test of character, a gauntlet that separates the men who belong from the men who don't, after which the survivors emerge as patched brothers in an organization built on genuine loyalty, genuine brotherhood, and a code of conduct that the outside world doesn't fully understand, but that real men recognize immediately. There is truth in that version. There is also a great deal left out of it, and what is left out is not left out by accident. The prospecting phase, the period between a man's formal introduction to a motorcycle club and his vote into full patch membership, is remarkably consistent in its formal structure across 1%er clubs. A man comes in as a hangaround. No status, no patches, no formal recognition from the club, just permission to be present at events and to be observed by the men who will eventually decide his fate. If the hangaround period goes well enough to generate a sponsor, a full patch member willing to vouch for him before the chapter, he becomes a prospect. The prospect wears the club's name on his vest, but not the full patch, a visible marker of his incomplete status that every other club in the outlaw world can read immediately. He pays dues. He attends every church meeting the club holds. He is available to every full patch member for whatever that member requires, at whatever hour the requirement arises. He serves. He waits. He does not ask when it ends. The prospect phase in a serious 1%er club typically runs a minimum of 1 year. In many chapters of major clubs, it runs significantly longer, 18 months, 2 years, occasionally more, depending on the chapter's assessment of the man's readiness and the specific political dynamics that shape any given vote. During that period, the prospect has no vote at the table, no voice in club deliberations, and no rights within the internal hierarchy that full patch members are obligated to respect. He is, in the language that the men who have actually been through it use consistently, a servant. ATF agent Ken Croak, who spent 2 years undercover inside the Pagans Motorcycle Club and documented the experience in his memoir, Out in the Cold, described the prospect experience with the specificity of a man who had lived it rather than theorized about it. As a prospect, I was considered a servant, a slave, or even less, he wrote. It's like college fraternity hazing, except that you can be beaten into a coma or killed at any moment. ATF agent William Queen, who infiltrated the Mongols Motorcycle Club under the alias Billy Street. John, and subsequently wrote Under and Alone, described the same dynamic from a different club with the same essential conclusion. As a prospect, you're a slave, the property of the club. You have to do everything a member tells you to do, from hauling drugs and guns to wiping a member's ass if he orders you to. Federal undercover agents who become prospects in outlaw clubs undergo training, have cover teams positioned nearby, and carry operational support that no ordinary civilian prospect could access. They still describe the experience as the most psychologically demanding, sustained challenge of their professional lives. For civilians who walk into the prospect phase without federal backup, without cover teams, without any institutional support structure, the experience is the same thing, minus every safety net. What follows are the 8 things that motorcycle clubs do not tell you before you prospect. They are drawn from documented undercover accounts, federal court records, former member testimony, and the specific institutional logic of organizations that law enforcement agencies have been studying for 5 decades. They are not designed to glamorize the outlaw motorcycle world or to condemn it. They are designed to tell the truth about it, which is something the clubs themselves are structurally motivated to avoid doing until you are already inside and the decision has already been made. The mythology is not random, it serves a specific function. The version of the prospect experience that circulates in public, the test of character, the fire that produces brothers rather than burning them, is the version that the clubs want circulating. It makes recruitment easier. It makes the men who are drawn to it feel that they are being offered something meaningful rather than something dangerous. It makes the friend who walked in 6 months ago and is now wearing a cut look from the outside, like he has been through something that made him better, rather than something that made him more exposed. The clubs understand this. The management of the public narrative around prospecting is not accidental. Clubs that let their members talk too freely about what the process actually involves generate the kind of federal law enforcement attention that makes the business of being an outlaw club significantly more complicated. Clubs that maintain the mythology, the brotherhood story, the rite of passage story, the legitimate organizational structure story have a protective layer of public ambiguity that makes every prosecution more difficult and every jury selection more complicated. The mythology is operational. It is maintained deliberately. And the man contemplating the prospect phase is operating inside that deliberate maintenance without necessarily knowing that is what he is doing. The most honest accounts of what the prospecting phase actually involves come from the men who had the specific and unusual vantage point of going through it while simultaneously being paid by the federal government to document what they saw. Their accounts are consistent with each other across different clubs, different eras, and different geographic locations. The specific content changes, the structure does not. Serve, wait, maintain silence, demonstrate willingness to commit to the organization above everything else, and understand that the organization's assessment of your performance will determine your future in ways that no written standard and no personal performance can fully predict or control. That is the prospect phase. That is what nobody tells you before you decide it's what you want. 1. Your sponsor's reputation is your ceiling and your floor. The first thing no club tells a prospective member is the single most important structural reality of the prospecting process. Your trajectory is determined less by your own conduct than by the standing of the man who agreed to sponsor you. This is not a rumor or a speculation. It is the documented and consistent organizational logic of how 1%er clubs manage the introduction of new members. The sponsor, the full patch member who has agreed to vouch for you before the chapter, who has put his own reputation on the line by recommending that the club invest the time and the risk of the prospect phase in you, is the lens through which every other full patch member evaluates everything you do during your time as a prospect. His standing in the chapter shapes the floor beneath you. His standing shapes the ceiling above you. And his problems become your problems in ways that you will not be told about in advance and cannot control from inside the process once it has begun. When ATF undercover operative Ken Croak, working inside the Pagans, watched a New Jersey prospect get dragged behind a canopy and beaten with axe handles at a major club event, the mechanism was precise. Something about either the prospect's conduct or the sponsor's standing within the mother club had produced the response, a response that fell on the prospect rather than on the man who had vouched for him. The operative described hearing the screaming from the distance he was maintaining. The prospect was never seen at the event again and was not seen afterward. The sponsor was present at breakfast the following morning. The practical consequence of this structural reality is significant and specific for anyone contemplating a prospect phase. You can perform perfectly, attend every event, complete every task, serve every full patch member without complaint, maintain the code of silence, demonstrate every quality the club has communicated it values, and still fail to get your patch because your sponsor has a problem inside the chapter that has nothing to do with your conduct. You can also benefit from sponsorship by a well-positioned, highly respected full patch member in ways that allow your prospect period to be shorter, your experience less punishing, and your vote more favorable than a technically equivalent candidate sponsored by a man with less standing. The club will not tell you this before you commit to the process. It has no incentive to. There is one more dimension that the recruitment process does not acknowledge. If your sponsor is removed from the club, expelled, arrested, killed, or otherwise removed from the position of vouching for you, your status as a prospect becomes immediately precarious in ways that no written rule can protect you from. You came in through a man. That man's status defines yours. If his status ends, yours is renegotiated on terms that the chapter sets and that you have no formal mechanism to contest from below. The selection of a sponsor is not simply a social choice about which member you have developed a relationship with. It is the most consequential organizational decision you will make in the entire process. The club will not frame it that way. You should. The sponsor relationship has one more dimension that almost never gets discussed in the public mythology around prospecting, and it is the one that most directly affects the man who successfully completes his prospect period and achieves full membership. The sponsor's relationship to you does not end at the patch ceremony. In most 1%er clubs, the sponsor maintains a specific and ongoing responsibility for the conduct of the man he vouched for. If the new full patch member makes decisions that embarrass the club, generates law enforcement attention through reckless conduct, or violates the code in ways that the chapter has to manage, the sponsor bears a portion of the institutional cost of those failures. This creates a dynamic that runs in both directions. The sponsor has a stake in your success that continues past the vote, and you have an ongoing relationship with someone who has the specific standing within the chapter to manage the aftermath of your mistakes in ways that others don't. This ongoing accountability structure is one of the features of the sponsor relationship that federal prosecutors have used most effectively in RICO cases against outlaw motorcycle clubs. The relationship between a sponsor and his prospects, the documented calls, the documented meetings, the documented presence at the same events, the documented financial transactions that sometimes flow through those relationships creates evidentiary connections that are extremely useful to prosecutors building a conspiracy case. The man who sponsored you is the man whose conversations about club business you had the most natural access to. He is the man whose decisions you were most likely to observe. He is the man whose conduct became most legible to you during the prospect period. And he is therefore the man whose federal exposure most directly translates into your own, if a case is built and cooperation becomes part of the equation for any party involved. 2. The vote is never just about you. Every major outlaw motorcycle club operates the same basic membership decision process at the chapter level. A prospect's full patch application comes before the chapter for a vote, and the vote must meet the threshold the club's bylaws specify. Some clubs require a simple majority. The Hells Angels, historically, have required a unanimous vote. A single dissenting voice is sufficient to block a prospect's full patch, regardless of how many members vote in favor. What the prospecting process does not explain, what it has no structural incentive to explain, is that the vote on your patch is frequently not really a vote about you at all. It is a vote that men who have axes to grind with your sponsor, who have outstanding disputes with each other that predate your arrival at the club by years, or who hold grievances about chapter direction that have accumulated over time before you walked through the door, will use to settle accounts that have nothing to do with your fitness for membership. Your application to the club's hierarchy is a political object within that hierarchy. It will be used as a political object. The question of whether you would be a good brother is one of the factors in that vote. It is not necessarily the primary one. This is documented not in the abstract, but in specific accounts from men who have observed or participated in the process from the inside. Former patch holders describing their own prospect experiences or the experiences of men they watched go through the same chapter at the same time consistently describe votes against prospects that everyone present understood to be statements about something else entirely. A sergeant-at-arms' ongoing conflict with the president. A chapter faction's dissatisfaction with a policy direction. A specific debt between two senior members that had not yet been settled. The prospect's fate was collateral damage in a dispute he had not caused, could not resolve, and would never be officially told was the actual reason his patch was denied. The additional dimension of this reality is that any single full patch member who decides, for any reason, that your vote should not succeed on a particular night can simply request that the vote be postponed. In clubs that require unanimity, the postponement is indefinite because the blocking member's consent is required and there is no mechanism for overriding that consent short of the member changing his own position. You are not told before you commit to the process that your year or 2 years of prospecting can be extended at any time, for any reason, by a single man who holds you personally in contempt, or who holds your sponsor personally in contempt, or who simply decides that the current moment is not the right moment for your vote, and that the right moment will arrive when certain other things have been resolved. The man who enters the prospect phase believing that hard work and loyalty will produce a predictable outcome on on a predictable timeline is operating on assumptions that the organizational culture does not share and the club's bylaws do not guarantee. There is a specific category of vote failure that the mythology around prospecting is most careful to obscure. The vote that fails, not because the prospect has done anything wrong, but because the chapter is using the vote to send a message to someone else. In this scenario, the man whose patch is being voted on is not the actual subject of the communication being made. The subject is his sponsor, who is being told that his standing in the chapter is insufficient to produce the votes his prospect needs. Or the subject is the chapter president, who is being told by a blocking faction that his organizational agenda is not going to proceed on his preferred timeline. Or the subject is the chapter itself, which is being told by the blocking member that certain things need to be resolved before any new members enter the ranks. The prospect in this scenario is aware that the vote did not go his way. He is not told why it did not go his way. The explanation he receives, if he receives any explanation at all, is filtered through the same institutional culture that controlled his access to information during the entire prospect phase. What he is told about his vote failure is exactly what the chapter decides to tell him, which is exactly as much as the chapter decides is useful. The actual political communication that was made through his failed vote application remains entirely within the chapter's internal world, invisible to the man whose future was used to make it. This is not the exception. Former patch holders who have spoken publicly about the prospect phase from inside the clubs they served consistently describe the vote as the point of maximum opacity in a process that is already structured around managing what the prospect is allowed to know. The gap between the reason the vote failed and the reason the prospect is given for its failure is, in many documented cases, very large. The prospect's response to a vote failure, his patience, his continued service, his demonstrated willingness to continue without receiving a satisfactory explanation is itself a data point in the chapter's ongoing evaluation of whether he should eventually receive different treatment. 3. What you owe doesn't stop when you get patched. There is a specific belief that many men carry into the prospect phase which the club does nothing to correct, because correcting it would serve the prospect's interests rather than the club's. The belief that the obligations of the prospect phase end when the patch is awarded. They do not. They change form. They become more formal. They do not end. The fundamental obligation that the prospecting process installs in a man, the obligation to serve the organization's interests above his own, to be available for the club's requirements whenever those requirements arise, to maintain the code of silence regardless of what the silence costs, him personally does not disappear at the patch ceremony. The ceremony marks a change in status and a change in the distribution of who can give you orders. The underlying structure of obligation that the prospecting process was designed to install in you is not cancelled by the ceremony, it is formalized by it. ATF agent William Queen, describing his time inside the Mongols at the full patch level, noted something precise about the dynamic that awaited a man after receiving his colors. I had no doubt these guys genuinely loved Billy Street John and would have laid down their lives for him, but they wouldn't hesitate to murder Billy Queen. The distinction is important. The club loves the member it has made. What it will not tolerate is the emergence of the person behind the member, the interests, the relationships, the loyalties, and the priorities that predate the club and that do not align with the club's institutional requirements. A fully patched member who chooses his family over club business, who chooses his personal safety over a club obligation, who chooses cooperation with law enforcement over the code of silence, that man has not just broken a rule. He has violated the foundational contract that the prospecting process was designed to make him internalize so thoroughly that the violation feels impossible. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club's internal patches communicate this reality with a directness that no recruitment pitch would match. A patch reading, "Snitches are a dying breed," is not a cultural metaphor. According to federal prosecutors who have worked Outlaws cases, that patch signifies the gang's commitment to identify, expel, and, if necessary, murder individuals associated with the club who cooperate with law enforcement. The commitment encoded in that patch is lifelong. It does not expire with the prospect period. It does not expire when a man leaves the club. In documented cases across multiple clubs and multiple decades, Men who left outlaw motorcycle clubs and subsequently cooperated with law enforcement investigations have been killed for doing so years after their formal departure from the organization. In March 2019, Jason Brown, a 43-year-old former prospect for an outlaw motorcycle club from Guelph, Ontario, was kidnapped in Harriston and murdered. His body was discovered in Oshawa. He was not a current member, he was a former prospect. The men charged with his murder included a full patch member who had been, in the language the club used for it, his brother. The obligation that the prospect phase installs does not end when the patch arrives, and it does not end when you decide you would like to leave. The Gypsy Jokers Motorcycle Club case that the ATF prosecuted in Oregon illustrates the permanent nature of the club's obligations with a specificity that makes the abstract principle concrete. In that case, which produced federal RICO convictions, including life sentences, members of the club were charged with murdering a former member who had been removed from the organization. The victim had been inside the organization. He had subsequently been removed. He was not, at the time of his death, an active member of anything. He was a former member. The club's obligation to manage what he knew and what he might say did not expire when his membership did. The enforcement of the Code of Silence extended to someone who was no longer technically covered by it, because the information he possessed was still considered covered by it, regardless of his current membership status. The institutional logic of this is the same logic that the prospect phase installs in a man from his first days as a hangaround. What happens inside stays inside. The geographic and temporal scope of inside is defined by the club, not by the man who is subject to it. A man who attended 3 events as a hangaround, declined to proceed to the prospect phase, and returned to his ordinary life is, in the club's institutional understanding, still covered by the informal code he agreed to by attending those events. He may not understand this. The club does. And the club's enforcement of that code, including in the extreme cases, violent enforcement, is not contingent on the man's continued formal participation in the organization. This is the dimension of the prospect phase that almost no one discusses before a man decides to enter it, because discussing it would make clear that the decision to enter the prospecting orbit of an outlaw motorcycle club has consequences that the decision to stop does not fully reverse. You can leave the prospect phase. You cannot unattend the events you attended, unhear the conversations you heard, or unknow the men you came to know. The club knows that too. 4. The federal government knows your name before your patch does. The prospecting process is, from the outside and from the perspective of the organization conducting it, a security screening. It is designed to identify men who will be reliable, loyal, and able to maintain the code of silence under pressure. The clubs have developed these screening processes over decades of operating under federal law enforcement scrutiny, and they have incorporated into those processes specific mechanisms designed to detect the specific threat that federal undercover operations represent, the man who is not who he says he is. Major 1%er clubs run informal background checks on prospects. Some use former law enforcement contacts. Some consult criminal defense attorneys who have handled cases involving members from other clubs. Some conduct their own investigation of a prospect's social network, his friends, his family, his employment history, his known associations, looking for the specific patterns that might indicate federal employment or law enforcement contact. The Hells Angels, according to law enforcement sources who have studied their intake procedures, have at various points used polygraphs and private investigators to vet membership candidates. Some chapters of some clubs have developed protocols for running prospects through scenarios specifically designed to reveal whether the candidate has the willingness to participate in criminal activity that membership requires. Because an undercover agent cannot commit actual crimes as part of the prospecting process without risking his cover being blown when the charges arrive. What the clubs do not advertise, and what is essential for anyone contemplating the prospect phase to understand, is that the federal government is also running a background check. They are running it before you prospect, they are running it while you prospect, and they will be running it for years after you complete the prospect phase and become a fully patched member. The intelligence file that federal agencies maintain on outlaw motorcycle clubs and their members is not compiled reactively. It is built continuously, through informants, through surveillance, through the monitoring of social media and communications, through the testimony that men inside these organizations have provided in federal cases going back decades. By the time a man becomes a full-patch member of a major outlaw motorcycle club, the federal agencies that track those clubs already know significant amounts about him, his criminal history, his known associations, the men who sponsored him and the chapter he joined, the events he attended as a prospect, and the men he was documented speaking with at those events. In some cases, the specific conversations he had at those events, because informants who were present reported them afterward, or because surveillance equipment that he did not know about was in place. ATF Operation Black Biscuit, which ran from 2002 to 2003 and involved Agent J. Dobbins prospecting for and ultimately achieving full patch status with the Hells Angels Cave Creek chapter in Arizona, was built over 21 months. The club's own vetting process, sophisticated enough to have excluded federal undercover agents on multiple previous attempts, was defeated by the sustained investment the ATF made over that period. The club's members who built genuine relationships with Dobbins over those 21 months were simultaneously building the evidentiary foundation of their own federal prosecution. By the time the indictments came down in June 2003, the federal file on each of them was comprehensive. The prospect who walks into a club chapter believing that successfully completing the club's screening process means he has passed the relevant security check does not understand which organization's assessment matters most for what his life will look like in 5 years. The broader context of this surveillance reality is what makes it so disorienting for men who complete the prospect phase and become fully patched members without any prior experience of being the subject of sustained federal attention. The first indication that the federal file has been building often comes not in the form of an arrest, but in the form of a search warrant. Officers arriving at a location the member is associated with, not necessarily to arrest him, but to gather physical evidence that fills out a file that has been growing for years. That experience, the moment when the abstract reality of federal surveillance becomes concrete in the form of uniformed officers with a warrant, lands differently on the man who understood from the beginning that it was a possibility than it lands on the man who completed the prospect phase, believing that the club's vetting process had also somehow screened out the federal government's attention. The ATF has described its approach to outlaw motorcycle club investigations as intelligence-led rather than incident-driven. This means the agencies are not waiting for crimes to happen and then building cases. They are building organizational understanding, first mapping the hierarchy, identifying the key relationships, documenting the financial flows, and then using that organizational understanding to identify the specific criminal conduct that produces prosecutable charges. By the time that criminal conduct is identified and charged, the background file that contextualizes it may be years old. The man whose name appears in that file may have no idea that the name has been there the entire time. 5. Infiltration runs in both directions. The competitor content that motivated this investigation mentioned one of the most significant and least discussed aspects of the prospect phase: the documented reality that men prospect into clubs specifically to gather information about those clubs, working for rival organizations or for law enforcement. This is not a paranoid speculation. It is documented in federal case files and in the personal accounts of the undercover agents who did it. ATF agent William Queen spent 3 years inside the Mongols Motorcycle Club as a prospect and then as a full patch member. 3 years attending events, building friendships, participating in club activities, and accumulating the evidence that ultimately produced the charges against the club's members. The men who considered him a brother during those 3 years, who told him things they told no one outside the club, who voted him into full patch membership they had no way of knowing, within the club's ordinary vetting procedures, that he was building federal cases against them. He was too good at being a Mongol. J. Dobbins spent 21 months working his way from hang-around status to full-patch member of the Hells Angels Cave Creek chapter. Ken Croak spent 2 years inside the Pagans. Charles Falco spent years across 3 different clubs, the Vagos, the Mongols, and the Outlaws, as an undercover informant. Each of these men went through the prospect phase, completed it, and in some cases achieved full membership, while the men around them believed they were evaluating a loyal candidate. The clubs know this. The most sophisticated chapters have developed counter-infiltration protocols that go beyond basic background checks. Some chapters separate what any single prospect is told and observed doing from what others are told and observed doing, limiting the exposure any single potential infiltrator can access. Some use test scenarios requests to participate in criminal activity significant enough that a law enforcement officer could not comply without committing an actual crime as a checkpoint. None of these measures have proven reliably effective against sufficiently committed and sufficiently resourced undercover operations. The practical implication for a man in the prospect phase is uncomfortable and important. The man prospecting beside you may be there to watch you. The information you share with him about the club's operations, about what you have been asked to do, about which members gave you which orders, may be the information that appears in a federal indictment with your name on it several years later. The club will not tell you this risk exists. It will not tell you which precautions it is taking to manage it, because telling you would reveal more about the club's relationship to federal law enforcement than the club finds it useful for prospects to know. The club's counter-infiltration measures have become more sophisticated as the federal government's undercover operations have become more documented. After Operation Black Biscuit was publicly revealed, and after Jay Dobyns's book No Angel described in detail how the operation worked, which was also a detailed description of where the club's defenses had failed, the Hells Angels and other major clubs undertook assessments of what had allowed the penetration to succeed and what could be done to prevent a similar success in the future. The specific vulnerabilities Operation Black Biscuit exploited were primarily about the sustained investment of time and resources. Dobyns and his team had spent 21 months building credibility, committing to the role with a depth that the club's ordinary vetting process had not been designed to test against. The club's defenses were calibrated against attempts that lasted weeks or months. They were not calibrated against an operation willing to invest years. Subsequent counter-infiltration measures by sophisticated clubs have included longer probationary periods before prospects gain access to sensitive information, more rigorous segmentation of what any single prospect is exposed to, and specific test scenarios designed to require genuine criminal participation rather than performed credibility. None of these measures have been tested to conclusion against a sufficiently committed undercover operation since the documentation of Black Biscuit, which means the clubs do not fully know whether their current defenses are adequate. They suspect they have improved them. They cannot be certain. The prospect who enters this environment, where the club is actively looking for federal infiltration, where every new person is viewed through the lens of the possibility that they are not who they say they are, is entering a surveillance environment that runs in every direction simultaneously. The club is watching him. Federal agencies are watching the club, and men inside the club who are working with federal agencies are watching everyone, including him. 6. The code of silence is absolute, even when it costs you everything. The code of silence that governs outlaw motorcycle clubs is not a cultural norm or a vague understanding between men who prefer not to involve law enforcement in their affairs. It is an institutional mechanism with real enforcement and real consequences, and it applies to everything, not just to information about the club's criminal operations, but to everything the club does, everything its members say, and everything that happens to you while you are inside the prospect phase. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club maintains a patch that reads, "Snitches are a dying breed." Federal prosecutors who have worked outlaws' cases do not describe this as a slogan. They describe it as a policy statement, the club's documented commitment to identify, expel, and, if necessary, murder individuals associated with the club who cooperate with law enforcement. The word murder is in the prosecutorial description of what the patch means. This position is documented in federal court records and is not disputed, and it is not unique to the outlaws. The Hells Angels, the Mongols, the Bandidos, the Pagans, every major 1%er club has a documented history of violence against men who broke the code, and in multiple documented cases that violence has extended to men who had already left the organization and believed their departure had ended their exposure. What this means for the man in the prospect phase is specific and consequential. Everything you witness, everything you are asked to do, And everything you refuse to do is subject to the code in ways that your participation in the prospect phase has already bound you to before you fully understood what that binding meant. If you witness a crime during your prospect phase and subsequently report it to law enforcement, you are not simply an informant in the organizational culture's understanding of that word. You are a traitor. The distinction between a prospect who cooperates and a full patch member who cooperates is not a significant one in the club's assessment of appropriate consequences. The courts have recognized this dynamic in specific federal cases across multiple clubs and multiple decades. Men who were killed after leaving clubs without authorization. Men who were killed after deciding not to complete certain assignments during their prospect period. Men who were killed years after their formal departure from the organization. All documented in federal case files as examples of the code's enforcement at various levels of organizational formalization. The code is not conditional on membership status. It does not have a grace period. It does not expire. The prospect who walks into the code of silence without fully understanding that he cannot simply walk out of it by declining to participate or by formally departing from the organization is walking into something that no subsequent decision can undo. The specific psychological mechanism by which the code of silence is installed in a man during the prospect phase is more sophisticated than the simple instruction to say nothing. It is installed through the systematic creation of complicity. The tasks that a prospect is asked to perform during the prospecting period, the errands, the services, the acts committed on behalf of members create a shared history of conduct between the prospect and the organization that the code of silence then protects. By the time a man completes a significant portion of his prospect phase, he is maintaining the code of silence not simply out of loyalty or fear, but out of the specific self-interest that comes from having participated in activities whose public disclosure would carry legal consequences for him. Personally, this is the mechanism that ATF undercover agents describe as the most psychologically complex dimension of the undercover assignment. To convincingly inhabit the prospect role, an undercover agent has to participate in enough of the club's activities to be credible as a genuine prospect. But the activities that make an undercover agent credible as a prospect are the activities that create the legal exposure that would normally motivate a non-agent to maintain the code of silence. The agent can be extracted when the operation concludes. A genuine prospect who has generated the same conduct record cannot be extracted. He is part of it. Charles Falco, who went through this process across 3 clubs and wrote Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, My Infiltration of America's Deadliest Biker Gangs, described the specific progressive quality of the complicity accumulation, how each step into the club's world makes the next step feel more like a continuation than a decision, how the code of silence stops feeling like an external rule and starts feeling like a natural expression of shared interest. The silence is not required because someone told you to be silent. The silence is required because you are silent. By the time a man completes his prospect phase, the code and the self are no longer distinguishable. 7. Your personal life has already been changed before you know it. The impact of the prospect phase on a man's life outside the club begins before the prospect phase does, and it continues in ways that most men do not anticipate until the consequences are already established and cannot be reversed. Employment implications arrive first and arrive quietly. Background checks that employers run will begin to flag documented associations, social media connections to club members, appearances at club events that are recorded in databases that law enforcement maintains, your name appearing in the club's own records. All of these generate patterns that employers in certain fields, in industries with security clearance requirements, or in organizations with federal contracting obligations cannot ignore. Men who have spent years building careers in law enforcement, in the military, in federal government employment, in security-sensitive industries, have had those careers ended by the prospect phase before the patch was awarded or declined. The association itself, independent of any specific criminal conduct, carries consequences that no one at the recruitment stage mentions, because no one at the recruitment stage is thinking about your employment prospects. Family implications arrive next and are more immediately devastating for many men than the professional consequences. The time demands of the prospect phase, the events that must be attended, the church meetings that cannot be missed, the availability that full-patch members expect at all hours, the specific combination of loyalty tests and physical tasks and emotional investments that the prospect phase requires impose a structural conflict with family obligations that the recruiting process does not acknowledge. ATF agent William Queen described the specific psychological experience at the end of his 3-year Mongols infiltration that real prospects mirror in their own terms. The club had become his world, and the family he had before the club had become something he was maintaining at a distance, while his primary relationships were with men inside the organization. The time investment the prospect phase requires is not something that marriages absorb without damage. It is not something that children absorb without noticing. The legal implications are the third wave, and they are the ones with the longest consequences. Being present at events where criminal activity occurred, even if you were not a participant, creates documented associations. Being identified in the same locations as men who are subsequently charged with federal offenses creates documented associations. Being named in the club's own records as a prospect during a period when the chapter was conducting the specific activities that a federal RICO case is built around creates documented associations. None of these require conviction. None of them even require arrest. They require only the federal investigator who builds the case file and the jury who eventually reads it. The legal exposure of the prospect phase does not begin when criminal conduct begins. It begins when documented association begins, which is before you have any official status at all. The ATF's assessment of what happens to the lives of men who become full-patch members of major outlaw motorcycle clubs, documented across multiple prosecutions and multiple decades, identifies employment, family, and legal exposure as the 3 dimensions that most consistently produce the kind of desperation that turns members into federal witnesses. This is not coincidental. These are the 3 dimensions in which the cost of club membership becomes most visible and most concrete, and they are the 3 dimensions that the prospect phase did the most to destabilize before membership was even achieved. Men who become federal witnesses in outlaw motorcycle club cases, the informants and cooperators who provide the testimony that federal RICO cases are built on, consistently describe the same progression. The employment consequences of their association started limiting their options. The family consequences of the time investment started eroding their relationships. The legal exposure of their activities started creating a risk profile that made the cost of continued membership exceed the value of the brotherhood. And the specific combination of all 3 at the same time, compounding each other with no obvious way out that didn't carry its own severe costs, produced the decision to cooperate. The clubs understand this progression. The institutional response is the code of silence, which is designed to prevent the moment when the accumulation of external costs produces cooperation with the people who have been building cases against the club. The code works for a significant proportion of the men it is applied to. For the men, it does not work for the ones whose family consequences, employment consequences, and legal consequences combined to produce a different calculation. It produces the federal witnesses who make the prosecutions possible. The prospect who enters the process without understanding this progression is not simply unaware of a risk. He is unaware of the specific mechanism by which the risk will eventually be activated, and of the institutional response that will be available to him when it is. 8. Leaving is never as simple as deciding to leave. The final thing that no motorcycle club tells a prospective member before he commits to the process is the one that defines the outer boundary of everything that has come before. The exit is not symmetrical with the entrance. Walking into a club is a decision a man makes at a specific moment, on his own terms, in response to his own assessment of what the club offers him and what he offers the club. Walking out is not a decision he makes at a specific moment. It is a negotiation that the club controls, conducted on terms the club sets, in a context where the club holds all the institutional power and the departing member holds whatever the club decides to allow him to hold. The outcome of that negotiation depends on the specific circumstances of the departure, the specific man's history with the club, the specific political dynamics of the chapter at the moment he attempts to leave, and the specific assessment that the club's leadership makes of how dangerous the departing member is to the organization's interests. Men who leave outlaw motorcycle clubs in good standing with the club's agreement, on terms that the leadership approves, having completed their obligations to the club's satisfaction, described the experience as fundamentally the club's choice rather than their own. David LaBrava, who left the Hells Angels in April 2019 after decades of membership, posted his departure to Instagram with language that was carefully chosen, in good standing, honorably, of my own free will. Those qualifications, good standing, honorably, of my own free will, are not redundant phrases. They are the specific categories that club culture uses, and the distinction between authorized and unauthorized has life or death implications in documented cases across multiple clubs and multiple decades. Men who leave clubs without authorization, who decide they want out, and communicate that decision without first obtaining the chapter's agreement about the terms under which the departure is acceptable, face a range of consequences that the club's internal culture describes with specific language. They are said to have bad patched or to have left dirty. A man who leaves dirty has violated the foundational contract of the membership in a way that leaves the club's response entirely within the club's discretion. Documented responses across multiple clubs and multiple decades include sustained harassment, destruction of property, targeted violence against the departing member, and, in the most severe documented cases, death. Jason Brown, the 43-year-old former prospect from Ontario whose body was discovered in Oshawa in March 2019, was not a man who had been an organizational enemy. He had been inside the organization's orbit. He had been someone's prospect. His alleged killers included a man who had been his brother in the specific language that clubs use for that relationship. Leaving the orbit of a serious outlaw motorcycle club is not something that can be undone by the decision to leave. It is something that the club processes on its own timeline and by its own standards, and the man who initiated the departure has no control over either once the conversation has been started. The specific asymmetry between entering and exiting outlaw motorcycle clubs is not a bug in the organizational design, it is a feature. An organization whose members can exit freely, on their own terms, at the moment they decide the costs exceed the benefits, is an organization that cannot maintain the code of silence that makes its operations possible. The difficulty of exit is the enforcement mechanism that makes the code work. You maintain silence, not just because of loyalty, but because the alternative exit without authorization, which leads to the specific category of consequences that unauthorized departures produce, is assessed as more costly than continued silence. This is why the club's response to unauthorized exits tends to be disproportionate to the organizational threat of the specific departing member poses. A low-ranking former prospect who leaves dirty and tells a small number of people about what he witnessed during his prospect period is not, in the strict operational sense, a catastrophic security threat. But the public response to his departure, the visible enforcement of the code against someone who violated it, is not primarily about the specific information he shared. It is about the message his treatment sends to every other current and former member who is watching and calculating. The enforcement of the exit cost is the mechanism that makes every other member's cost calculation come out in the club's favor. The prospect who understands this is looking at his own situation more clearly than the prospect who believes that the difficulty of exit is an unfortunate byproduct of the organizational culture rather than the central enforcement mechanism of a code of silence that the organization cannot function without. Leaving is never as simple as deciding to leave. It was always designed not to be. What nobody tells you before you decide. The men who describe the prospecting experience most honestly are not the men who are currently inside organizations that have institutional reasons to manage how the experience is described. They are the men who have come out the other side as former patch holders, as federal informants whose cooperation gave them both immunity and a specific vantage point from which to assess what they were actually inside, or as federal agents who spent years undercover in organizations that recruited, tested, and in some cases accepted them as brothers without knowing what they were. Those men describe the prospect phase consistently. The brotherhood is real. The specific bond that forms between men who have been through the process together, who have served the same organization in the same difficult circumstances, who have sat across the table from each other through the specific kind of collective decision-making that a club church requires. That bond is genuine, in ways that men who have not experienced it find difficult to fully credit. The loyalty that the culture builds and maintains is functional. It actually works for the purposes the club needs it to work for, in the specific circumstances the club operates in. The brotherhood is also conditional in ways that the recruitment process obscures. It is conditional on your continued usefulness to the organization. It is conditional on your continued maintenance of the code of silence, regardless of what that silence costs you personally. It is conditional on your continued willingness to prioritize the club's interests above your own family's interests, your own safety, and your own legal exposure. And it is conditional on the club's continuing assessment that you are an asset rather than a liability, an assessment that you do not control and that the club will not share with you until the moment it has already made its decision. ATF agent J. Dobbins, writing about his time inside the Hells Angels after Operation Black Biscuit concluded, described the specific psychological weight of what the prospecting process had built in him, even as a federal agent who knew what he was doing and why. The relationships felt real, the loyalty felt real. The sense of belonging to something that the outside world didn't understand felt real. And then the investigation concluded, the indictments came down, and the men who had treated him as a brother understood what he had actually been doing. His house was subsequently firebombed. The threat against him and his family lasted for years after the operation ended. The brotherhood was real, so were its consequences. Charles Falco, who spent years across 3 different clubs as an undercover informant for the ATF, described the culture with the bluntness of someone who had seen it from the inside and then processed the full picture from the outside. There is no romantic view. These guys are thugs, and more than anything, they're murderers, drug dealers, and bullies. They don't like normal society, and they hate normal civilians. That is a harsh assessment, and it does not capture the full complexity of what outlaw motorcycle club culture actually contains: the genuine brotherhood, the genuine loyalty, the genuine sense of identity that the patch provides, the genuine bond that forms between men who have served together in the specific and demanding conditions the prospect phase creates. But it is an honest one, from a man who spent enough time inside multiple clubs to see past the mythology to what the day-to-day reality actually looked like. The prospect who walks into a club chapter with the mythology intact and the reality obscured is walking into a situation where the full accounting will arrive eventually. The question is not whether the accounting comes, it is when it comes, and whether the man who receives it understood what he was agreeing to when he agreed to it. Every year, men walk into outlaw motorcycle clubs believing they understand what the process costs. The ones who come out the other side as patch holders who stayed, as ex-members who left, as federal informants whose cooperation gave them both immunity and perspective, as former undercover agents whose files have been declassified, all say some version of the same thing. I understood the price in the abstract. I did not understand it in the concrete until the concrete arrived. The patch is real, the brotherhood is real, the price is also real, and nobody put the full price on the table before you signed. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are more investigations like this one coming, and they don't get lighter.